The Dream, a classic short story by Mary Shelley. Ci dice mal d'amore, dice una falsità. Italian song. The time of the occurrence of the little legend about to be narrated was that of the commencement of the reign of Henry IV, of France, whose accession and conversion, while they brought peace to the kingdom whose throne he ascended, were inadequate to heal the deep wounds mutually inflicted by the inimical parties. Private feuds and the memory of mortal injuries existed between those now apparently united, and often did the hands that had clasped each other in seeming friendly greeting, involuntarily, as the grasp was released, clasp the dagger's hilt, as fitter spokesman to their passions than the words of courtesy that had just fallen from their lips. Many of the fiercer Catholics retreated to their distant provinces, and while they concealed in solitude their rankling discontent, not less keenly did they long for the day when they might show it openly. In a large and fortified chateau built on a rugged steep overlooking the Loire, not far from the town of Nantes, dwelt the last of her race, and the heiress of their fortunes, the young and beautiful Countess de Villeneuve. She had spent the preceding year in complete solitude in her secluded abode, and the mourning she wore for a father and two brothers, the victims of the civil wars, was a graceful and good reason why she did not appear at court and mingle with its festivities. But the orphan countess inherited a high name and broad lands, and it was soon signified to her that the king, her guardian, desired that she should bestow them, together with her hand, upon some noble whose birth and accomplishments should entitle him to the gift. Constance, in reply, expressed her intention of taking vows and retiring to a convent. The king earnestly and resolutely forbade this act, believing such an idea to be the result of sensibility overwrought by sorrow, and relying on the hope that after a time the genial spirit of youth would break through this cloud. A year passed, and still the countess persisted, and at last Henry, unwilling to exercise compulsion, desirous, too, of judging for himself of the motives that led one so beautiful, young and gifted with fortune's favours, to desire to bury herself in a cloister, announced his intention, now that the period of her mourning was expired, of visiting her chateau, and if he brought not with him, the monarch said, inducements sufficient to change her design, he would yield his consent to its fulfilment. Many a sad hour had Constance passed, many a day of tears and many a night of restless misery. She had closed her gates against every visitant, and like the Lady Olivia in Twelfth Night, vowed herself to loneliness and weeping. Mistress of herself, she easily silenced the entreaties and remonstrances of underlings, and nursed her grief as it had been the thing she loved. Yet it was too keen, too bitter, too burning to be a favoured guest. In fact, Constance, young, ardent, and vivacious, battled with it, struggled, and longed to cast it off. But all that was joyful in itself, or fair in outward show, only served to renew it, and she could best support the burden of her sorrow with patience when, yielding to it, it oppressed but did not torture her. Constance had left the castle to wander in the neighbouring grounds. Lofty and extensive as were the apartments of her abode, she felt pent up within their walls, beneath their fretted roofs. The spreading uplands and the antique wood, associated to her with every dear recollection of her past life, enticed her to spend hours and days beneath their leafy coverts. The motion and change eternally working as the wind stirred among the boughs, or the journeying sun rained its beams through them, soothed and called her out of that dull sorrow which clutched her heart with so unrelenting a pang beneath her castle roof. There was one spot on the verge of the well-wooded park, one nook of ground, whence she could discern the country extended beyond, yet which was in itself thick set with tall umbrageous trees, a spot which she had forsworn, yet whither unconsciously her steps for ever tended, and where now again, for the 20th time that day, she had unaware found herself. She sat upon a grassy mound, and looked wistfully on the flowers she had herself planted to adorn the verdurous recess, to her the temple of memory and love. She held the letter from the king which was the parent to her of so much despair. Dejection sat upon her features, and her gentle heart asked fate, why, so young, unprotected, and forsaken, she should have to struggle with this new form of wretchedness. I but ask, she thought. To live in my father's halls, in the spot familiar to my infancy, to water with my frequent tears the graves of those I loved, and here in these woods, where such a mad dream of happiness was mine, to celebrate for ever the obsequies of hope. A rustling among the boughs now met her ear. Her heart beat quick. All again was still. Foolish girl, she half muttered, dupe of thine own passionate fancy, because here we met, because seated here I have expected, and sounds like these have announced his dear approach. So now every coney as it stirs, and every bird as it awakens silence, speaks of him. O Gaspar, mine once, never again will this beloved spot be made glad by thee, never more. Again the bushes were stirred, and footsteps were heard in the brake. She rose, her heart beat high. It must be that silly Manon, with her impertinent entreaties for her to return. But the steps were firmer and slower than would be those of her waiting woman. And now, emerging from the shade, she too plainly discerned the intruder. Her first impulse was to fly, but once again to see him, to hear his voice. Once again, before she placed eternal vows between them, to stand together and find the wide chasm filled which absence had made, could not injure the dead, and would soften the fatal sorrow that made her cheek so pale. And now he was before her, the same beloved one with whom she had exchanged vows of constancy. He, like her, seemed sad, nor could she resist the imploring glance that entreated her for one moment to remain. "I come, lady," said the young knight, "without a hope to bend your inflexible will. I come but once again to see you, and to bid you farewell before I depart for the Holy Land. I come to beseech you not to immure yourself in the dark cloister to avoid one as hateful as myself, one you will never see more. Whether I die or live, France and I are parted forever." "That were fearful, were it true," said Constance. "But King Henry will never so lose his favourite cavalier. The throne you helped to build, you still will guard. Nay, as I ever had power over thought of thine, go not to Palestine. One word of yours could detain me, one smile, Constance." And the youthful lover knelt before her, but her harsher purpose was recalled by the image once so dear and familiar, now so strange and so forbidden. "Linger no longer here," she cried. "No smile, no word of mine will ever again be yours. Why are you here, here where the spirits of the dead wander, and claiming these shades as their own, curse the false girl who permits their murderer to disturb their sacred repose?" "When love was young and you were kind," replied the knight, "you taught me to thread the intricacies of these woods. You welcomed me to this dear spot, where once you vowed to be my own, even beneath these ancient trees." "A wicked sin it was," said Constance, "to unbar my father's doors to the son of his enemy, and dearly is it punished." The young knight gained courage as she spoke, yet he dared not move, lest she, who every instant appeared ready to take flight, should be startled from her momentary tranquillity. But he slowly replied, "Those were happy days, Constance, full of terror and deep joy, when evening brought me to your feet, and while hate and vengeance were as its atmosphere to yonder frowning castle, this leafy, starlit bower was the shrine of love." "Happy, miserable days," echoed Constance, "when I imagined good could arise from failing in my duty, and that disobedience would be rewarded of God. Speak not of love, Gaspar. A sea of blood divides us forever. Approach me not. The dead and the beloved stand even now between us. Their pale shadows warn me of my fault, and menace me for listening to their murderer." "That am not I," exclaimed the youth. "Behold, Constance, we are each the last of our race. Death has dealt cruelly with us, and we are alone. It was not so when first we loved, when parent, kinsman, brother, nay, my own mother breathed curses on the house of Villeneuve, and in spite of all I blessed it. I saw thee, my lovely one, and blessed it. The God of peace planted love in our hearts, and with mystery and secrecy we met during many a summer night in the moonlit dells. And when daylight was abroad in this sweet recess, we fled to avoid its scrutiny. And here, even here, where now I kneel in supplication, we both knelt and made our vows. Shall they be broken?" Constance wept as her lover recalled the images of happy hours. "Never," she exclaimed. "Oh, never. Thou knowest, or wilt soon know, Gaspar, the faith and resolves of one who dare not be yours. Was it for us to talk of love and happiness, when war and hate and blood were raging around? The fleeting flowers our young hands strewed were trampled by the deadly encounter of mortal foes. By your father's hand mine died, and little boots it to know whether, as my brother swore, and you deny, your hand did or did not deal the blow that destroyed him. You fought among those by whom he died. Say no more, no other word. It is impiety towards the unreposing dead to hear you. Go, Gaspar, forget me. Under the chivalrous and gallant Henry your career may be glorious, and some fair girl will listen as once I did to your vows and be made happy by them. Farewell, may the Virgin bless you. In my cell and cloister home I will not forget the best Christian lesson, to pray for our enemies. Gaspar, farewell. She glided hastily from the bower. With swift steps she threaded the glade and sought the castle. Once within the seclusion of her own apartment, she gave way to the burst of grief that tore her gentle bosom like a tempest. For hers was that worst sorrow which taints past joys, making remorse wait upon the memory of bliss, and linking love and fancied guilt in such fearful society as that of the tyrant when he bound a living body to a corpse. Suddenly a thought darted into her mind. At first she rejected it as puerile and superstitious, but it would not be driven away. She called hastily for her attendant. "Manon," she said, "didst thou ever sleep on St. Catherine's couch?" Manon crossed herself. "Heaven forfend, none ever did since I was born, but two. One fell into the Loire and was drowned. The other only looked upon the narrow bed and returned to her own home without a word. It is an awful place, and if the votary have not led a pious and good life, woe betide the hour when she rests her head on the holy stone." Constance crossed herself also. "As for our lives, it is only through our Lord and the blessed saints that we can any of us hope for righteousness. I will sleep on that couch tomorrow night." "Dear my lady, and the king arrives tomorrow." "The more need that I resolve. It cannot be that misery so intense should dwell in any heart and no cure be found. I had hoped to be the bringer of peace to our houses, and is the good work to be for me a crown of thorns? Heaven shall direct me. I will rest tomorrow night on St. Catherine's bed, and if, as I have heard, the saint deigns to direct her votaries in dreams, I will be guided by her, and believing that I act according to the dictates of heaven, I shall feel resigned even to the worst." The king was on his way to Nantes from Paris, and he slept on this night at a castle but a few miles distant. Before dawn a young cavalier was introduced into his chamber. The knight had a serious, nay, a sad aspect, and all beautiful as he was in feature and limb, looked way-worn and haggard. He stood silent in Henry's presence, who, alert and gay, turned his lively blue eyes upon his guest, saying gently, "So thou foundest her obdurate, Gaspar." "I found her resolved on our mutual misery. Alas, my liege, it is not, credit me, the least of my grief that Constance sacrifices her own happiness when she destroys mine." "And thou believest that she will say nay to the Gaillard chevalier whom we ourselves present to her?" "Oh, my liege, think not that thought, it cannot be. My heart deeply, most deeply, thanks you for your generous condescension, but she whom her lover's voice in solitude, whose entreaties, when memory and seclusion aided the spell, could not persuade, will resist even your majesty's commands. She is bent upon entering a cloister, and I, so please you, will now take my leave. I am henceforth a soldier of the cross." "Gaspar," said the monarch, "I know woman better than thou. It is not by submission nor tearful plaints she is to be won. The death of her relatives naturally sits heavy at the young countess's heart, and nourishing in solitude her regret and her repentance, she fancies that heaven itself forbids your union. Let the voice of the world reach her, the voice of earthly power and earthly kindness, the one commanding, the other pleading, and both finding response in her own heart. And by my fay and the Holy Cross, she will be yours. Let our plans still hold. And now, to horse, the morning wears and the sun is risen." The king arrived at the bishop's palace and proceeded forthwith to mass in the cathedral. A sumptuous dinner succeeded, and it was afternoon before the monarch proceeded through the town beside the Loire to where, a little above Nantes, the Château Villeneuve was situated. The young countess received him at the gate. Henry looked in vain for the cheek blanched by misery, the aspect of downcast despair which he had been taught to expect. Her cheek was flushed, her manner animated, her voice scarce tremulous. She loves him not, thought Henry, or already her heart has consented. A collation was prepared for the monarch, and after some little hesitation arising even from the cheerfulness of her mien, he mentioned the name of Gaspar. Constance blushed instead of turning pale and replied very quickly, "Tomorrow, good my liege. I ask for a respite, but until tomorrow, all will then be decided. Tomorrow I am vowed to God, or—" She looked confused, and the king, at once surprised and pleased, said, "Then you hate not young de Vaudemont? You forgive him for the inimical blood that warms his veins." "We are taught that we should forgive, that we should love our enemies," the countess replied with some trepidation. "Now, by Saint Denis, that is a right welcome answer for the novice," said the king, laughing. "What ho! My faithful serving man, Dan Apollo in disguise, come forward and thank your lady for her love." In such disguise as had concealed him from all, the cavalier had hung behind and viewed with infinite surprise the demeanour and calm countenance of the lady. He could not hear her words, but was this even she whom he had seen trembling and weeping the evening before? This she whose very heart was torn by conflicting passion, who saw the pale ghosts of parent and kinsman stand between her and the lover whom more than her life she adored? It was a riddle hard to solve. The king's call was in unison with his impatience, and he sprang forward. He was at her feet, while she, still passion-driven, overwrought by the very calmness she had assumed, uttered one cry as she recognized him and sank senseless on the floor. All this was very unintelligible. Even when her attendants had brought her to life, another fit succeeded, and then passionate floods of tears, while the monarch, waiting in the hall, eyeing the half-eaten collation and humming some romance in commemoration of woman's waywardness, knew not how to reply to Vaudemont's look of bitter disappointment and anxiety. At length the countess's chief attendant came with an apology. Her lady was ill, very ill. The next day she would throw herself at the king's feet, at once to solicit his excuse and to disclose her purpose. "Tomorrow, again tomorrow!" "Does tomorrow bear some charm, maiden?" said the king. "Can you read us the riddle, pretty one? What strange tale belongs to tomorrow that all rests on its advent?" Manon coloured, looked down, and hesitated. But Henry was no tyro in the art of enticing ladies' attendants to disclose their ladies' counsel. Manon was besides frightened by the countess's scheme, on which she was still obstinately bent, so she was the more readily induced to betray it. To sleep in St. Catherine's bed, to rest on a narrow ledge overhanging the deep rapid Loire, and if, as was most probable, the luckless dreamer escaped from falling into it, to take the disturbed visions that such uneasy slumber might produce for the dictate of heaven, was a madness of which even Henry himself could scarcely deem any woman capable. But could Constance, her whose beauty was so highly intellectual, and whom he had heard perpetually praised for her strength of mind and talents, could she be so strangely infatuated? And can passion play such freaks with us, like death, levelling even the aristocracy of the soul, and bringing noble and peasant, the wise and foolish under one thraldom? It was strange, yet she must have her way. That she hesitated in her decision was much, and it was to be hoped that St. Catherine would play no ill-natured part. Should it be otherwise, a purpose to be swayed by a dream might be influenced by other waking thoughts. To the more material kind of danger, some safeguard should be brought. There is no feeling more awful than that which invades a weak human heart bent upon gratifying its ungovernable impulses in contradiction to the dictates of conscience. Forbidden pleasures are said to be the most agreeable. It may be so to rude natures, to those who love to struggle, combat, and contend, who find happiness in a fray and joy in the conflict of passion. But softer and sweeter was the gentle spirit of Constance, and love and duty contending crushed and tortured her poor heart. To commit her conduct to the inspirations of religion, or if it was so to be named of superstition, was a blessed relief. The very perils that threatened her undertaking gave a zest to it. To dare for his sake was happiness. The very difficulty of the way that led to the completion of her wishes at once gratified her love, and distracted her thoughts from her despair. Or if it was decreed that she must sacrifice all, the risk of danger and of death were of trifling import in comparison with the anguish which would then be her portion forever. The night threatened to be stormy. The raging wind shook the casements, and the trees waved their huge shadowy arms, as giants might in fantastic dance and mortal broil. Constance and Manon, unattended, quitted the chateau by a postern, and began to descend the hillside. The moon had not yet risen, and though the way was familiar to both, Manon tottered and trembled, while the Countess, drawing her silken cloak round her, walked with a firm step down the steep. They came to the river's side, where a small boat was moored, and one man was in waiting. Constance stepped lightly in, and then aided her fearful companion. In a few moments they were in the middle of the stream. The warm, tempestuous, animating equinoctial wind swept over them. For the first time since her mourning, a thrill of pleasure swelled the bosom of Constance. She hailed the emotion with double joy. It cannot be, she thought, that heaven will forbid me to love one so brave, so generous, and so good as the noble Gaspar. Another I can never love. I shall die if divided from him. And this heart, these limbs, so alive with glowing sensation, are they already predestined to an early grave? Oh no, life speaks aloud within them. I shall live to love. Do not all things love? The winds as they whisper to the rushing waters, the waters as they kiss the flowery banks and speed to mingle with the sea. Heaven and earth are sustained by and live through love. And shall Constance alone, whose heart has ever been a deep, gushing, overflowing well of true affection, be compelled to set a stone upon the fount to lock it up forever? These thoughts bade fair for pleasant dreams, and perhaps the Countess, an adept in the blind god's law, therefore indulged them the more readily. But as thus she was engrossed by soft emotions, Manon caught her arm. "Lady, look!" she cried. "It comes, yet the oars have no sound. Now the Virgin shield us. Would we were at home." A dark boat glided by them. 4 rowers habited in black cloaks pulled at oars which, as Manon said, gave no sound. Another sat at the helm. Like the rest, his person was veiled in a dark mantle, but he wore no cap, and though his face was turned from them, Constance recognised her lover. "Gaspar!" she cried aloud. "Dost thou live?" But the figure in the boat neither turned its head nor replied, and quickly it was lost in the shadowy waters. How changed now was the fair Countess's reverie! Already heaven had begun its spell, and unearthly forms were around as she strained her eyes through the gloom. Now she saw, and now she lost view of the bark that occasioned her terror. And now it seemed that another was there, which held the spirits of the dead. And her father waved to her from shore, and her brothers frowned on her. Meanwhile they neared the landing. Her bark was moored in a little cove, and Constance stood upon the bank. Now she trembled, and half yielded to Manon's entreaty to return, till the unwise suivante mentioned the king's and de Vaudemont's name, and spoke of the answer to be given tomorrow. What answer, if she turned back from her intent? She now hurried forward up the broken ground of the bank, and then along its edge, till they came to a hill which abruptly hung over the tide. A small chapel stood near. With trembling fingers, the Countess drew forth the key and unlocked its door. They entered. It was dark, save that a little lamp, flickering in the wind, showed an uncertain light from before the figure of St. Catherine. The 2 women knelt, they prayed, and then rising, with a cheerful accent, the Countess bade her attendant good night. She unlocked a little low iron door. It opened on a narrow cavern. The roar of waters was heard beyond. "Thou mayest not follow, my poor Manon," said Constance, "nor dost thou much desire. This adventure is for me alone." It was hardly fair to leave the trembling servant in the chapel alone, who had neither hope nor fear, nor love, nor grief to beguile her. But in those days, esquires and waiting women often played the part of subalterns in the army, gaining knocks and no fame. Besides, Manon was safe in holy ground. The Countess, meanwhile, pursued her way, groping in the dark through the narrow, tortuous passage. At length what seemed light to her long darkened sense gleamed on her. She reached an open cavern in the overhanging hillside, looking over the rushing tide beneath. She looked out upon the night. The waters of the Loire were speeding, as since that day have they ever sped, changeful yet the same. The heavens were thickly veiled with clouds, and the wind in the trees was as mournful and ill-omened as if it rushed round a murderer's tomb. Constance shuddered a little and looked upon her bed, a narrow ledge of earth and a moss-grown stone bordering on the very verge of the precipice. She doffed her mantle. Such was one of the conditions of the spell. She bowed her head and loosened the tresses of her dark hair. She bared her feet, and thus, fully prepared for suffering to the utmost the chill influence of the cold night, she stretched herself on the narrow couch that scarce afforded room for her repose, and whence, if she moved in sleep, she must be precipitated into the cold waters below. At first it seemed to her as if she never should sleep again. No great wonder that exposure to the blast and her perilous position should forbid her eyelids to close. At length she fell into a reverie so soft and soothing that she wished even to watch. And then by degrees her senses became confused, and now she was on St. Catherine's bed, the Loire rushing beneath and the wild wind sweeping by, and now, oh whither? And what dreams did the saint send, to drive her to despair, or to bid her be blessed for ever? Beneath the rugged hill upon the dark tide another watched, who feared 1,000 things, and scarce dared hope. He had meant to precede the lady on her way, but when he found that he had outstayed his time, with muffled oars and breathless haste, he had shot by the bark that contained his Constance, nor even turned at her voice, fearful to incur her blame and her commands to return. He had seen her emerge from the passage, and shuddered as she leant over the cliff. He saw her step forth, clad as she was in white, and could mark her as she lay on the ledge beetling above. What a vigil did the lovers keep! She given up to visionary thoughts, he knowing. And the consciousness thrilled his bosom with strange emotion, that love, and love for him, had led her to that perilous couch, and that while dangers surrounded her in every shape, she was alive only to the small, still voice that whispered to her heart the dream which was to decide their destinies. She slept perhaps, but he waked and watched, and night wore away as, now praying, now entranced by alternating hope and fear, he sat in his boat, his eyes fixed on the white garb of the slumberer above. Morning? Was it morning that struggled in the clouds? Would morning ever come to waken her? And had she slept? And what dreams of weal or woe had peopled her sleep? Gaspar grew impatient. He commanded his boatmen still to wait, and he sprang forward, intent on clambering the precipice. In vain they urged the danger, nay, the impossibility of the attempt. He clung to the rugged face of the hill and found footing where it would seem no footing was. The acclivity, indeed, was not high, the dangers of St. Catherine's bed arising from the likelihood that anyone who slept on so narrow a couch would be precipitated into the waters beneath. Up the steep ascent, Gaspar continued to toil, and at last reached the roots of a tree that grew near the summit. Aided by its branches, he made good his stand at the very extremity of the ledge, near the pillow on which lay the uncovered head of his beloved. Her hands were folded on her bosom, her dark hair fell round her throat and pillowed her cheek. Her face was serene. Sleep was there in all its innocence and in all its helplessness. Every wilder emotion was hushed, and her bosom heaved in regular breathing. He could see her heart beat as it lifted her fair hands crossed above. No statue hewn of marble in monumental effigy was ever half so fair, and within that surpassing form dwelt a soul true, tender, self-devoted, and affectionate as ever warmed a human breast. With what deep passion did Gaspar gaze, gathering hope from the placidity of her angel countenance. A smile wreathed her lips, and he too involuntarily smiled as he hailed the happy omen, when suddenly her cheek was flushed, her bosom heaved, a tear stole from her dark lashes, and then a whole shower fell as, starting up, she cried, "No! He shall not die! I will unloose his chains! I will save him!" Gaspar's hand was there. He caught her light form ready to fall from the perilous couch. She opened her eyes and beheld her lover, who had watched over her dream of fate, and who had saved her. Manon also had slept well, dreaming or not, and was startled in the morning to find that she waked surrounded by a crowd. The little desolate chapel was hung with tapestry, the altar adorned with golden chalices, the priest was chanting mass to a goodly array of kneeling knights. Manon saw that King Henry was there, and she looked for another whom she found not, when the iron door of the cavern passage opened, and Gaspard de Vaudemont entered from it, leading the fair form of Constance, who in her white robes and dark dishevelled hair, with a face in which smiles and blushes contended with deeper emotion, approached the altar, and, kneeling with her lover, pronounced the vows that united them forever. It was long before the happy Gaspard could win from his lady the secret of her dream. In spite of the happiness she now enjoyed, she had suffered too much not to look back even with terror to those days when she thought love a crime, and every event connected with them wore an awful aspect. Many a vision, she said, she had that fearful night. She had seen the spirits of her father and brothers in paradise. She had beheld Gaspard victoriously combating among the infidels. She had beheld him in King Henry's court, favoured and beloved. And she herself, now pining in a cloister, now a bride, now grateful to heaven for the full measure of bliss presented to her, now weeping away her sad days, till suddenly she thought herself in Paynim land, and the saint herself, Saint Catherine, guiding her unseen through the city of the infidels. She entered a palace and beheld the miscreants rejoicing in victory. And then, descending to the dungeons beneath, they groped their way through damp vaults and low, mildewed passages, to one cell, darker and more frightful than the rest. On the floor lay one with soiled and tattered garments, with unkempt locks and wild, matted beard. His cheek was worn and thin. His eyes had lost their fire. His form was a mere skeleton. The chains hung loosely on the fleshless bones. "And was it my appearance in that attractive state and winning costume that softened the hard heart of Constance?" asked Gaspard, smiling at this painting of what would never be. "Even so," replied Constance, "for my heart whispered me that this was my doing, and who could recall the life that waned in your pulses, who restore, save the destroyer? My heart never warmed to my living happy knight as then it did to his wasted image as it lay, in the visions of night at my feet. A veil fell from my eyes. A darkness was dispelled from before me. Methought I then knew for the first time what life and what death was. I was bid believe that to make the living happy was not to injure the dead, and I felt how wicked and how vain was that false philosophy which placed virtue and good in hatred and unkindness. You should not die. I would loosen your chains and save you and bid you live for love. I sprung forward, and the death I deprecated for you would, in my presumption, have been mine, then, when first I felt the real value of life, but that your arm was there to save me, your dear voice to bid me be blessed forevermore." The Evil Eye, a short story by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. The wild Albanian kirtled to his knee, with shawl-girt head and ornamented gun, and gold-embroidered garments fair to see, the crimson-scarfed man of Macedon. Lord Byron. The Morio, Catustius Ziani, travelled wearily and in fear of its robber inhabitants through the Pashalik of Yanina. Yet he had no cause for dread. Did he arrive, tired and hungry, in a solitary village? Did he find himself in the uninhabited wilds suddenly surrounded by a band of clefts? Or in the larger towns did he shrink at finding himself, soul of his race among the savage mountaineers and despotic Turk. As soon as he announced himself the Pobratimo, one of Dmitri of the Evil Eye, every hand was held out, every voice spoke welcome. 1. In Greece, especially in Illyria and Epirus, it is no uncommon thing for persons of the same sex to swear friendship. The church contains a ritual to consecrate this vow. 2 men thus united are called pobratimi, the women posistrime. The Albanian Dimitri was a native of the village of Corvo. Among the savage mountains of the district between Yanina and Terpellene, the deep, broad stream of Argyro Castro flows, bastioned to the west by abrupt wood-covered precipices, shadowed to the east by elevated mountains. The highest among these is Mount Trebochi, and in a romantic folding of that hill, distinct with minarets, crowned by a dome rising from out a group of pyramidal cypresses, is the picturesque village of Corvo. Sheep and goats form the apparent treasure of its inhabitants. Their guns and yataghans, their warlike habits, and with them, the noble profession of robbery, are sources of still greater wealth. Among a race renowned for dauntless courage and sanguinary enterprise, Dmitri was distinguished. It was said that in his youth, this cleft was remarkable for a gentler disposition and more refined taste than is usual with his countrymen. He had been a wanderer and had learned European arts, of which he was not a little proud. He could read and write Greek, and a book was often stowed beside his pistols in his girdle. He had spent several years in Scio, the most civilized of the Greek islands, and had married a Sciote girl. The Albanians are characterized as despisers of women, but Dmitri, in becoming the husband of Helena, enlisted under a more chivalrous rule and became the proselyte of a better creed. Often he returned to his native hills and fought under the banner of the renowned Ali, and then came back to his island home. The love of the tamed barbarian was concentrated, burning, and something beyond this. It was a portion of his living, beating heart, the nobler part of himself, the diviner mould in which his rugged nature had been recast. On his return from one of his Albanian expeditions, he found his home ravaged by the Mainotes. Helena, they pointed to her tomb, nor dared tell him how she died. His only child, his lovely infant daughter, was stolen. His treasure house of love and happiness was rifled, its gold-excelling wealth changed to blank desolation. Dmitri spent 3 years in endeavours to recover his lost offspring. He was exposed to 1,000 dangers, underwent incredible hardships. He dared the wild beast in his lair, the Mainote in his port of refuge. He attacked and was attacked by them. He wore the badge of his daring in a deep gash across his eyebrow and cheek. On this occasion he had died, but that Catustius, seeing a scuffle on shore and a man left for dead, disembarked from a Morio Sacovella, carried him away, tended and cured him. They exchanged vows of friendship, and for some time the Albanian shared his brother's toils, but they were too pacific to suit his taste, and he returned to Corvo. Who in the mutilated savage could recognise the handsomest amongst the Arnauts? His habits kept pace with his change of physiognomy. He grew ferocious and hard-hearted. He only smiled when engaged in dangerous enterprise. He had arrived at that worst state of ruffian feeling, the taking delight in blood. He grew old in these occupations. His mind became reckless, his countenance more dark. Men trembled before his glance. Women and children exclaimed in terror, "The evil eye!" The opinion became prevalent. He shared it himself. He gloried in the dread privilege. And when his victim shivered and withered beneath the mortal influence, the fiendish laugh with which he hailed this demonstration of his power struck with worse dismay the failing heart of the fascinated person. But Dmitri could command the arrows of his sight, and his comrades respected him the more for his supernatural attribute since they did not fear the exercise of it on themselves. Dmitri had just returned from an expedition beyond Prevesa. He and his comrades were laden with spoil. They killed and roasted a goat whole for their repast. They drank dry several wineskins. Then, round the fire in the court, they abandoned themselves to the delights of the kerchief dance, roaring out the chorus as they dropped upon and then rebounded from their knees and whirled round and round with an activity all their own. The heart of Dmitri was heavy. He refused to dance and sat apart, at first joining in the song with his voice and lute, till the air changed to one that reminded him of better days. His voice died away. His instrument dropped from his hands, and his head sank upon his breast. At the sound of stranger footsteps, he started up. In the form before him, he surely recognized a friend. He was not mistaken. With a joyful exclamation, he welcomed Katustius Ziani, clasping his hand and kissing him on the cheek. The traveller was weary, so they retired to Dimitri's own home, a neatly plastered, whitewashed cottage whose earthen floor was perfectly dry and clean, and the walls hung with arms, some richly ornamented, and other trophies of his kleptic triumphs. A fire was kindled by his aged female attendant. The friends reposed on mats of white rushes while she prepared the pilaf and seethed flesh of kid. She placed a bright tin tray on a block of wood before them, and heaped upon it cakes of Indian corn, goat's milk cheese, eggs, and olives. A jar of water from their purest spring, and skin of wine served to refresh and cheer the thirsty traveller. After supper, the guest spoke of the object of his visit. "I come to my pobratimo," he said, "to claim the performance of his vow. When I rescued you from the savage Kakounis of Boularias, you pledged to me your gratitude and faith. Do you disclaim the debt?" Dimitri's brow darkened. "My brother," he cried, "need not remind me of what I owe. Command my life. In what can the mountain cleft aid the son of the wealthy Ziani?" "The son of Ziani is a beggar," rejoined Katustius, "and must perish if his brother deny his assistance." The Morio then told his tale. He had been brought up as the only son of a rich merchant of Corinth. He had often sailed as Karavokiri, two of his father's vessels, to Stamboul, and even to Calabria. Some years before, he had been boarded and taken by a Barbary corsair. His life since then had been adventurous, he said. In truth, it had been a guilty one. He had become a renegade, and won regard from his new allies, not by his superior courage, for he was cowardly, but by the frauds that make men wealthy. In the midst of this career, some superstition had influenced him, and he had returned to his ancient religion. He escaped from Africa, wandered through Syria, crossed to Europe, found occupation in Constantinople, and thus years passed. At last, as he was on the point of marriage with a Phanariote beauty, he fell again into poverty, and he returned to Corinth to see if his father's fortunes had prospered during his long wanderings. He found that while these had improved to a wonder, they were lost to him forever. His father, during his protracted absence, acknowledged another son as his, and dying a year before, had left all to him. Katustius found this unknown kinsman with his wife and child in possession of his expected inheritance. Cyril divided with him, it is true, their parents' property, but Katustius grasped at all and resolved to obtain it. He brooded over 1,000 schemes of murder and revenge, yet the blood of a brother was sacred to him, and Cyril, beloved and respected at Corinth, could only be attacked with considerable risk. Then his child was a fresh obstacle. As the best plan that presented itself, he hastily embarked for Butrinto, and came to claim the advice and assistance of the Arnaut whose life he had saved, whose pobratimo he was. Not thus barely did he tell his tale, but glossed it over, so that had Dimitri needed the incitement of justice, which was not at all a desideratum with him, he would have been satisfied that Cyril was a base interloper, and that the whole transaction was one of imposture and villainy. 2. Master of a merchant ship. All night these men discussed a variety of projects, whose aim was that the deceased Ziani's wealth should pass undivided into his elder son's hands. At morning's dawn, Katustius departed, and 2 days afterwards Dimitri quitted his mountain home. His first care had been to purchase a horse, long coveted by him on account of its beauty and fleetness. He provided cartridges and replenished his powder horn. His accoutrements were rich, his dress gay, his arms glittered in the sun. His long hair fell straight from under the shawl twisted round his cap, even to his waist. A shaggy white capote hung from his shoulder, his face wrinkled and puckered by exposure to the seasons, his brow furrowed with care, his mustachios long and jet black, his scarred face, his wild, savage eyes, his whole appearance not deficient in barbaric grace but stamped chiefly with ferocity and bandit pride, inspired, and we need not wonder, the superstitious Greek with a belief that a supernatural spirit of evil dwelt in his aspect, blasting and destroying. Now prepared for his journey, he departed from Corvo, crossing the woods of Acarnania on his way to Morea. "Wherefore does Zella tremble?" and press her boy to her bosom, as if fearful of evil. Thus asked Cyril Ziani, returning from the city of Corinth to his own rural abode. It was a home of beauty. The abruptly broken hills covered with olives or brighter plantations of orange trees overlooked the blue waves of the Gulf of Aegina. A myrtle underwood spread sweet scent around and dipped its dark shining leaves into the sea itself. The low-roofed house was shaded by 2 enormous fig trees, while vineyards and cornland stretched along the gentle upland to the north. When Zella saw her husband, she smiled, though her cheek was still pale and her lips quivering. "Now you are near to guard us," she said. "I dismiss fear, but danger threatens our Constans, and I shudder to remember that an evil eye has been upon him." Cyril caught up his child. "By my head!" he cried. "Thou speakest of an ill thing. The Franks call this superstition, but let us beware. His cheek is still rosy, his tresses flowing gold. Speak, Constans. Hail thy father, my brave fellow." It was but a short-lived fear. No ill ensued, and they soon forgot an incident which had causelessly made their hearts to quail. A week afterwards, Cyril returned, as he was wont, from shipping a cargo of currants to his retreat on the coast. It was a beautiful summer evening. The creaking water wheel, which produced the irrigation of the land, chimed in with the last song of the noisy cicala. The rippling waves spent themselves almost silently among the shingles. This was his home, but where its lovely flower? Zella did not come forth to welcome him. A domestic pointed to a chapel on a neighbouring acclivity, and there he found her. His child, nearly 3 years of age, was in his nurse's arms. His wife was praying fervently while the tears streamed down her cheeks. Cyril demanded anxiously the meaning of this scene, but the nurse sobbed. Zella continued to pray and weep, and the boy from sympathy began to cry. This was too much for man to endure. Cyril left the chapel. He leant against a walnut tree. His first exclamation was a customary Greek one. "Welcome this misfortune so that it comes single." But what was the ill that had occurred? Unapparent was it yet, but the spirit of evil is most fatal when unseen. He was happy, a lovely wife, a blooming child, a peaceful home, competence, and the prospect of wealth. These blessings were his, yet how often does fortune use such as her decoys? He was a slave in an enslaved land, a mortal subject to the high destinies, and 10,000 were the envenomed darts which might be hurled at his devoted head. Now, timid and trembling, Zella came from the chapel. Her explanation did not calm his fears. Again the evil eye had been on his child, and deep malignity lurked surely under this second visitation. The same man, an Arnaut, with glittering arms, gay attire, mounted on a black steed, came from the neighbouring ilex grove and, riding furiously up to the door, suddenly checked and reined in his horse at the very threshold. The child ran towards him. The Arnaut bent his sinister eyes upon him. "Lovely art thou, bright infant," he cried. "Thy blue eyes are beaming, thy golden tresses fair to see, but thou art a vision fleeting as beautiful. Look at me." The innocent looked up, uttered a shriek, and fell gasping on the ground. The women rushed forward to seize him. The Albanian put spurs to his horse, and galloping swiftly across the little plain, up the wooded hillside, he was soon lost to sight. Zella and the nurse bore the child to the chapel. They sprinkled him with holy water, and, as he revived, besought the Panagia with earnest prayers to save him from the menaced ill. Several months elapsed. Little Constans grew in intelligence and beauty. No blight had visited the flower of love, and its parents dismissed fear. Sometimes Cyril indulged in a joke at the expense of the evil eye, but Zella thought it unlucky to laugh, and crossed herself whenever the event was alluded to. At this time Katustius visited their abode. He was on his way, he said, to Stamboul, and he came to know whether he could serve his brother in any of his transactions in the capital. Cyril and Zella received him with cordial affection. They rejoiced to perceive that fraternal love was beginning to warm his heart. He seemed full of ambition and hope. The brothers discussed his prospects, the politics of Europe, and the intrigues of the Fana. The petty affairs of Corinth even were made subjects of discourse, and the probability that in a short time, young as he was, Cyril would be named Kodyabashi of the province. On the morrow, Katustius prepared to depart. "One favour does the voluntary exile ask," Will my brother and sister accompany me some hours on my way to Napoli, whence I embark?" Zella was unwilling to quit her home, even for a short interval, but she suffered herself to be persuaded, and they proceeded altogether for several miles towards the capital of the Morea. At noontide, they made a repast under the shadow of a grove of oaks, and then separated. Returning homeward, the wedded pair congratulated themselves on their tranquil life and peaceful happiness, contrasted with the wanderers' lonely and homeless pleasures. These feelings increased in intensity as they drew nearer their dwelling and anticipated the lisped welcome of their idolized child. From an eminence they looked upon the fertile vale which was their home. It was situated on the southern side of the isthmus and looked upon the Gulf of Aegina. All was verdant, tranquil, and beautiful. They descended into the plain. There a singular appearance attracted their attention. A plough with its yoke of oxen had been deserted midway in the furrow. The animals had dragged it to the side of the field and endeavoured to repose as well as their conjunction permitted. The sun already touched its western bourne, and the summits of the trees were gilded by its parting beams. All was silent. Even the eternal water-wheel was still. No menials appeared at their usual rustic labours. From the house, the voice of wailing was too plainly heard. "My child!" Zella exclaimed. Cyril began to reassure her. But another lament arose, and he hurried on. She dismounted and would have followed him, but sank on the roadside. Her husband returned. "Courage, my beloved," he cried. "I will not repose night nor day until Constance is restored to us. Trust to me. Farewell." With these words he rode swiftly on. Her worst fears were thus confirmed. Her maternal heart, lately so joyous, became the abode of despair, while the nurse's narration of the sad occurrence tended but to add worse fear to fear. Thus it was. The same stranger of the evil eye had appeared, not as before, bearing down on them with eagle speed, but as if from a long journey, his horse lame and with drooping head, the Arnaut himself covered with dust, apparently scarcely able to keep his seat. "By the life of your child," he said, "give a cup of water to one who faints with thirst." The nurse, with Constance in her arms, got a bowl of the desired liquid and presented it. Ere the parched lips of the stranger touched the wave, the vessel fell from his hands. The woman started back, while he, at the same moment darting forward, tore with strong arm the child from her embrace. Already both were gone. With arrowy speed they traversed the plain, while her shrieks and cries for assistance called together all the domestics. They followed on the track of the ravisher, and none had yet returned. Now, as night closed in, one by one they came back. They had nothing to relate. They had scoured the woods, crossed the hills. They could not even discover the route which the Albanian had taken. On the following day Cyril returned, jaded, haggard, miserable. He had obtained no tidings of his son. On the morrow he again departed on his quest, nor came back for several days. Zella passed her time wearily, now sitting in hopeless despondency, now climbing the near hill to see whether she could perceive the approach of her husband. She was not allowed to remain long thus tranquil. The trembling domestics, left in guard, warned her that the savage forms of several Arnauts had been seen prowling about. She herself saw a tall figure clad in a shaggy white capote steal round the promontory, and, on seeing her, shrink back. Once at night the snorting and trampling of a horse roused her, not from slumber, but from her sense of security. Wretched as the bereft mother was, she felt personally almost reckless of danger, but she was not her own. She belonged to one beyond expression dear, and duty, as well as affection for him, enjoined self-preservation. Cyril again returned. He was gloomier, sadder than before, but there was more resolution on his brow, more energy in his motions. He had obtained a clue, yet it might only lead him to the depths of despair. He discovered that Catustius had not embarked at Napoli. He had joined a band of Arnauts lurking about Vasilico, and had proceeded to Patras with the protocleft. Thence they put off together in a monoxylon for the northern shores of the Gulf of Lepanto. Nor were they alone. They bore a child with them wrapped in a heavy, torpid sleep. Poor Cyril's blood ran cold when he thought of the spells and witchcraft which had probably been put in practice on his boy. He would have followed close upon the robbers, but for the report that reached him that the remainder of the Albanians had proceeded southward towards Corinth. he could not enter upon a long, wandering search among the pathless wilds of Epirus, leaving Zella exposed to the attacks of these bandits. He returned to consult with her, to devise some plan of action which would at once ensure her safety and promise success to his endeavours. After some hesitation and discussion, it was decided that he should first conduct her to her native home, consult with her father as to his present enterprise, and be guided by his warlike experience before he rushed into the very focus of danger. The seizure of his child might only be a lure, and it were not well for him, sole protector of that child and its mother, to rush unadvisedly into the toils. Zella, strange to say, for her blue eyes and brilliant complexion belied her birth, was the daughter of a Mainote, yet dreaded and abhorred by the rest of the world as are the inhabitants of Cape Tenaris. They are celebrated for their domestic virtues and the strength of their private attachments. Zella loved her father, and the memory of her rugged, rocky home, from which she had been torn in an adverse hour. Near neighbours of the Mainotes, dwelling in the ruder and wildest portion of Maina, are the Kakavugnis, a dark, suspicious race of squat and stunted form, strongly contrasted with the tranquil cast of countenance characteristic of the Mainote. The two tribes are embroiled in perpetual quarrels. The narrow sea-girt abode which they share affords at once a secure place of refuge from the foreign enemy and all the facilities of internal mountain warfare. Cyril had once, during a coasting voyage, been driven by stress of weather into the little bay on whose shores is placed the small town of Cardamila. The crew at first dreaded to be captured by the pirates, but they were reassured on finding them fully occupied by their domestic dissensions. A band of Kakavugnis were besieging the castellated rock overlooking Cardamila, blockading the fortress in which the Mainote Capitano and his family had taken refuge. 2 days passed thus, while furious contrary winds detained Cyril in the bay. On the third evening, the western gale subsided, and a land breeze promised to emancipate them from their perilous condition, when in the night, as they were about to put off in a boat from shore, they were hailed by a party of Mainotes, and one, an old man of commanding figure, demanded a parley. He was the Capitano of Cardamila, the chief of the fortress, now attacked by his implacable enemies. He saw no escape. He must fall, and his chief desire was to save his treasure and his family from the hands of his enemies. Cyril consented to receive them on board. The latter consisted of an old mother, a Paramana, and a young and beautiful girl, his daughter. Cyril conducted them in safety to Napoli. Soon after, the Capitano's mother and Paramana returned to their native town, while, with her father's consent, fair Zella became the wife of her preserver. The fortunes of the Mainote had prospered since then, and he stood first in rank, the chief of a large tribe, the Capitano of Cardamila. Thither, then, the hapless parents repaired. They embarked on board a small sacovella which dropped down the Gulf of Aegina, weathered the islands of Scillo and Cherigo, and the extreme point of Tenaris. Favoured by prosperous gales, they made the desired port and arrived at the hospitable mansion of old Cameraz. He heard their tale with indignation, swore by his beard to dip his poniard in the best blood of Catustheus, and insisted upon accompanying his son-in-law on his expedition to Albania. No time was lost. The grey-headed mariner, still full of energy, hastened every preparation. Cyril and Zella parted. 1,000 fears, 1,000 hours of misery rose between the pair, late sharers in perfect happiness. The boisterous sea and distant lands were the smallest of the obstacles that divided them. They would not fear the worst. Yet hope, a sickly plant, faded in their hearts as they tore themselves asunder after a last embrace. Zella returned from the fertile district of Corinth to her barren native rocks. She felt all joy expire as she viewed from the rugged shore the lessening sails of the Sacovella. Days and weeks passed, and still she remained in solitary and sad expectation. She never joined in the dance, nor made one in the assemblies of her countrywomen who met together at evening-tide to sing, tell stories, and while away the time in dance and gaiety. She secluded herself in the most lonely part of her father's house, and gazed unceasingly from the lattice upon the sea beneath, or wandered on the rocky beach. And when tempest darkened the sky, and each precipitous promontory grew purple under the shadows of the wide-winged clouds, when the roar of the surges was on the shore, and the white crests of the waves, seen afar upon the ocean plain, showed like flocks of new-shorn sheep scattered along wide extended downs, she felt neither gale nor inclement cold, nor returned home till recalled by her attendants. In obedience to them, she sought the shelter of her abode, not to remain long, for the wild winds spoke to her, and the stormy ocean reproached her tranquillity. Unable to control the impulse, she would rush from her habitation on the cliff, nor remember, till she reached the shore, that her papooses were left midway on the mountain path, and that her forgotten veil and disordered dress were unmeet for such a scene. Often the unnumbered hours sped on, while this orphaned child of happiness leant on a cold, dark rock. The low-browed crags beetled over her, the surges broke at her feet, her fair limbs were stained by spray, her tresses dishevelled by the gale. Hopelessly she wept until a sail appeared on the horizon, and then she dried her fast-flowing tears, fixing her large eyes upon the nearing hull or fading topsail. Meanwhile the storm tossed the clouds into 1,000 gigantic shapes, and the tumultuous sea grew blacker and more wild. Her natural gloom was heightened by superstitious horror. The Morai, the old fates of her native Grecian soil, howled in the breezes, apparitions which told of her child pining under the influence of the evil eye, and of her husband, the prey of some Thracian witchcraft, such as still is practised in the dread neighbourhood of Larissa, haunted her broken slumbers and stalked like dire shadows across her waking thoughts. Her bloom was gone, her eyes lost their lustre, her limbs their round full beauty. Her strength failed her, as she tottered to the accustomed spot to watch. Vainly, yet forever to watch. What is there so fearful as the expectation of evil tidings delayed? Sometimes in the midst of tears, or worse, amidst the convulsive gaspings of despair, we reproach ourselves for influencing the eternal fates by our gloomy anticipations. Then, if a smile wreathe the mourner's quivering lip, it is arrested by a throb of agony. Alas! Are not the dark tresses of the young painted grey, the full cheek of beauty delved with sad lines by the spirits of such hours? Misery is a more welcome visitant when she comes in her darkest guise and wraps us in perpetual black. For then the heart no longer sickens with disappointed hope. Cyril and old Cameras had found great difficulty in doubling the many capes of the Morea as they made a coasting expedition from Cardamila to the Gulf of Arta, north of Cephalonia and St. Mauro. During their voyage they had time to arrange their plans. As a number of Morios travelling together might attract too much attention, they resolved to land their comrades at different points and travel separately into the interior of Albania. Yanina was their first place of rendezvous. Cyril and his father-in-law disembarked in one of the most secluded of the many creeks which diversify the winding and precipitous shores of the Gulf. 6 others chosen from the crew would, by other routes, join them at the capital. They did not fear for themselves. Alone, but well armed and secure in the courage of despair, they penetrated the fastnesses of Epirus. No success cheered them. They arrived at Yanina without having made the slightest discovery. They were joined by their comrades, whom they directed to remain 3 days in the town, and then separately to proceed to Terpelene, whither they immediately directed their steps. At the first village on their way thither, at monastic Zitza, they obtained some information, not to direct, but to encourage their endeavours. They sought refreshment and hospitality in the monastery, which is situated on a green eminence, crowned by a grove of oak trees, immediately behind the village. Perhaps there is not in the world a more beautiful or more romantic spot, sheltered itself by clustering trees, looking out on one widespread landscape of hill and dale, enriched by vineyards, dotted with frequent flocks. While the calamus in the depth of the vale gives life to the scene, and the far blue mountains of Zumerkas, Sagori, Sully, and Acroceronia to the east, west, north, and south, close in the various prospects. Cyril half envied the Kaloyas their inert tranquillity. They received the travellers gladly, and were cordial though simple in their manners. When questioned concerning the object of their journey, they warmly sympathised with the father's anxiety, and eagerly told all they knew. 2 weeks before, an Arnaout, well known to them as Dmitri of the Evil Eye, a famous cleft of Corvo, and a Morio arrived, bringing with them a child, a bold, spirited, beautiful boy, who, with firmness beyond his years, claimed the protection of the Caloyers and accused his companions of having carried him off by force from his parents. "By my head!" cried the Albanian. "A brave Palikar! He keeps his word, brother. He swore by the Panagia, in spite of our threats of throwing him down a precipice, food for the vulture, to accuse us to the first good men he saw. He neither pines under the evil eye, nor quails beneath our menaces." Catustius frowned at these praises, and it became evident during their stay at the monastery that the Albanian and the Morio quarrelled as to the disposal of the child. The rugged mountaineer threw off all his sternness as he gazed upon the boy. When little Constance slept, he hung over him, fanning away with woman's care the flies and gnats. When he spoke, he answered with expressions of fondness, winning him with gifts, teaching him, all child as he was, a mimicry of warlike exercises. When the boy knelt and besought the Panagia to restore him to his parents, his voice quivering and tears running down his cheeks, the eyes of Dmitri overflowed. He cast his cloak over his face. His heart whispered to him, "Thus perhaps my child prayed. Heaven was deaf. Alas, where is she now?" Encouraged by such signs of compassion, which children are quick to perceive, Constance twined his arms round his neck, telling him that he loved him, and that he would fight for him when a man, if he would take him back to Corinth. At such words Dmitri would rush forth, seek Catustius, remonstrate with him, till the unrelenting man checked him by reminding him of his vow. Still he swore that no hair of the child's head should be injured, while the uncle, unvisited by compunction, meditated his destruction. The quarrels which thence arose were frequent and violent, till Catustius, weary of opposition, had recourse to craft to obtain his purpose. One night he secretly left the monastery, bearing the child with him. When Dmitri heard of his evasion, it was a fearful thing to the good Caloyers only to look upon him. They instinctively clutched hold of every bit of iron on which they could lay their hands, so to avert the evil eye which glared with native and untamed fierceness. In their panic, a whole score of them had rushed to the iron-plated door which led out of their abode. With the strength of a lion, Dmitri tore them away, threw back the portal, and with the swiftness of a torrent fed by the thawing of the snows in spring, he dashed down the steep hill, the flight of an eagle not more rapid, the course of a wild beast not more resolved. Such was the clue afforded to Cyril. It were too long to follow him in his subsequent search. He, with old Camaraz, wandered through the vale of Argiro Castro and climbed Mount Trebucci to Corvo. Dmitri had returned. He had gathered together a score of faithful comrades and sallied forth again. Various were the reports of his destination and the enterprise which he meditated. One of these led our adventurers to Terpellene and hence back towards Yanina, and now chance again favoured them. They rested one night in the habitation of a priest at the little village of Mosme, about 3 leagues to the north of Zitza, and here they found an Arnaut who had been disabled by a fall from his horse. This man was to have made one of Dmitri's band. They learned from him that the Arnaut had tracked Catustius, following him close, and forcing him to take refuge in the monastery of the prophet Elias, which stands on an elevated peak of the mountains of Sagori, 8 leagues from Yanina. Dmitri had followed him, and demanded the child. The Caloyers refused to give it up, and the cleft, roused to mad indignation, was now besieging and battering the monastery, to obtain by force this object of his newly awakened affections. At Yanina, Camaraz and Cyril collected their comrades and departed to join their unconscious ally. He, more impetuous than a mountain stream or ocean's fiercest waves, struck terror into the hearts of the recluses by his ceaseless and dauntless attacks. To encourage them to further resistance, Catustius, leaving the child behind in the monastery, departed for the nearest town of Sagori, to entreat its Beluk Bashe to come to their aid. The Sagorians are a mild, amiable, social people. They are gay, frank, clever. Their bravery is universally acknowledged, even by the more uncivilized mountaineers of Zumurkas. Yet robbery, murder, and other acts of violence are unknown among them. These good people were not a little indignant when they heard that a band of Arnauts was besieging and battering the sacred retreat of their favourite Caloyers. They assembled in a gallant troop, and taking Catustius with them, hastened to drive the insolent clefts back to their ruder fastnesses. They came too late. At midnight, while the monks prayed fervently to be delivered from their enemies, Dmitri and his followers tore down their iron-plated door and entered the holy precincts. The protocleft strode up to the gates of the sanctuary and, placing his hands upon it, swore that he came to save, not to destroy. Constans saw him. With a cry of delight, he disengaged himself from the caloyer who held him and rushed into his arms. This was sufficient triumph. With assurance of sincere regret for having disturbed them, the cleft quitted the chapel with his followers, taking his prize with him. Catustius returned some hours after, and so well did the traitor plead his cause with the kind Segorians, bewailing the fate of his little nephew among those evil men, that they offered to follow, and, superior as their numbers were, to rescue the boy from their destructive hands. Catustius, delighted with the proposition, urged their immediate departure. At dawn they began to climb the mountain summits, already trodden by the Zumercians. Delighted with repossessing his little favourite, Dmitri placed him before him on his horse, and, followed by his comrades, made his way over the mountains, clothed with old Dodona's oaks, or, in higher summits, by dark, gigantic pines. They proceeded for some hours, and at length dismounted to repose. The spot they chose was the depth of a dark ravine, whose gloom was increased by the broad shadows of dark ilexes. An entangled underwood and a sprinkling of craggy, isolated rocks made it difficult for the horses to keep their footing. They dismounted and sat by the little stream. Their simple fare was spread, and Dmitri enticed the boy to eat by 1,000 caresses. Suddenly, one of his men, set as a guard, brought intelligence that a troop of Segorians, with Catustius as their guide, was advancing from the monastery of St. Elias, while another man gave the alarm of the approach of 6 or 8 well-armed Morios, who were advancing on the road from Yanina. In a moment, every sign of encampment had disappeared. The Arnauts began to climb the hills, getting under cover of the rocks, and behind the large trunks of the forest trees, keeping concealed till their invaders should be in the very midst of them. Soon the Morios appeared, turning round the defile, in a path that only allowed them to proceed 2 by 2. They were unaware of danger and walked carelessly, until a shot that whizzed over the head of one, striking the bough of a tree, recalled them from their security. The Greeks, accustomed to the same mode of warfare, betook themselves also to the safeguards of the rocks, firing from behind them, striving with their adversaries which should get to the most elevated station, jumping from crag to crag and dropping down and firing as quickly as they could load. One old man alone remained on the pathway. The mariner Camaraz had often encountered the enemy on the deck of his cake, and would still have rushed foremost at a boarding, but this warfare required too much activity. Cyril called on him to shelter himself beneath a low, broad stone. The Mainote waved his hand. "Fear not for me," he cried. "I know how to die." The brave love the brave. Dmitri saw the old man stand unflinching, a mark for all the balls, and he started from behind his rocky screen, calling on his men to cease. Then, addressing his enemy, he cried, "Who art thou? Wherefore art thou here? If ye come in peace, proceed on your way. Answer, and fear not." The old man drew himself up, saying, "I am a Mainote, and cannot fear. All Hellas trembles before the pirates of Cape Matapan, and I am one of these. I do not come in peace. Behold, you have in your arms the cause of our dissension. I am the grandsire of that child. Give him to me." Dmitri, had he held a snake which he felt awakening in his bosom, could not so suddenly have changed his cheer. The offspring of a Mainote. He relaxed his grasp. Constans would have fallen had he not clung to his neck. Meanwhile, each party had descended from their rocky station and were grouped together in the pathway below. Dmitri tore the child from his neck. He felt as if he could, with savage delight, dash him down the precipice. When, as he paused and trembled from excess of passion, Catustius and the foremost Segorians came down upon them. "Stand!" cried the infuriated Arnaut. "Behold, Catustius! Behold, friend, whom I, driven by the resistless fates, madly and wickedly forswore. I now perform thy wish. The Mainote child dies. The son of the accursed race shall be the victim of my just revenge." Cyril, in a transport of fear, rushed up the rock. He levelled his musket, but he feared to sacrifice his child. The old Mainote, less timid and more desperate, took a steady aim. Dimitri saw the act and hurled the dagger, already raised against the child, at him. It entered his side, while Constans, feeling his late protector's grasp relax, sprang from it into his father's arms. Camaraz had fallen, yet his wound was slight. He saw the Arnauts and Segorians close round him. He saw his own followers made prisoners. Dimitri and Catustheus had both thrown themselves upon Cyril, struggling to repossess themselves of the screaming boy. The Mainote raised himself. He was feeble of limb, but his heart was strong. He threw himself before the father and child. He caught the upraised arm of Dimitri. "On me," he cried. "Fall all thy vengeance, I of the evil race, for the child, he is innocent of such parentage. Mina cannot boast him for a son." "Man of lies," commenced the infuriated Arnaut, "this falsehood shall not stead thee." "Nay, by the souls of those you have loved, listen," continued Camaraz. "And if I make not good my words, may I and my children die. The boy's father is a Corinthian, his mother a Ceote girl." "Ceo!" The very word made the blood recede to Dimitri's heart. "Villain!" he cried, dashing aside Catustheus's arm, which was raised against poor Constans. "I guard this child! Dare not to injure him! Speak, old man, and fear not, so that thou speakest the truth." 15 years ago, said Camaraz, I hovered with my caique in search of prey on the coast of Schio. A cottage stood on the borders of a chestnut wood. It was the habitation of the widow of a wealthy islander. She dwelt in it with her only daughter, married to an Albanian, then absent. The good woman was reported to have a concealed treasure in her house. The girl herself would be rich spoil. It was an adventure worth the risk. We ran our vessel up a shady creek, and on the going down of the moon, landed, stealing under the covert of night towards the lonely abode of these women. Dimitri grasped at his dagger's hilt. It was no longer there. He half drew a pistol from his girdle. Little Constans, again confiding in his former friend, stretched out his hands and clung to his arm. The cleft looked on him, half yielded to his desire to embrace him, half feared to be deceived. So he turned away, throwing his capote over his face, veiling his anguish, controlling his emotions, till all should be told. Camaraz continued. It became a worse tragedy than I had contemplated. The girl had a child. She feared for its life and struggled with the men like a tigress defending her young. I was in another room seeking for the hidden store when a piercing shriek rent the air. I never knew what compassion was before. This cry went to my heart, but it was too late. The poor girl had sunk to the ground, the life-tide oozing from her bosom. I know not why, but I turned woman in my regret for the slain beauty. I meant to have carried her and her child on board, to see if aught could be done to save her, but she died ere we left the shore. I thought she would like her island grave best, and truly feared that she might turn vampire to haunt me, did I carry her away. So we left her corpse for the priests to bury, and carried off the child, then about 2 years old. She could say few words except her own name. That was Zella, and she is the mother of this boy. A succession of arrivals in the bay of Cardamila had kept poor Zella watching for many nights. Her attendant had, in despair of ever seeing her sleep again, drugged with opium the few cakes she persuaded her to eat. But the poor woman did not calculate on the power of mind over body, of love over every enemy, physical or moral, arrayed against it. Zella lay on her couch, her spirit somewhat subdued, but her heart alive, her eyes unclosed. In the night, led by some unexplained impulse, she crawled to her lattice and saw a little sacovella enter the bay. It ran in swiftly under favour of the wind and was lost to her sight under a jutting crag. Lightly, she trod the marble floor of her chamber. She drew a large shawl close round her. She descended the rocky pathway and reached, with swift steps, the beach. Still the vessel was invisible, and she was half inclined to think that it was the offspring of her excited imagination. Yet she lingered. She felt a sickness at her very heart whenever she attempted to move, and her eyelids weighed down in spite of herself. The desire of sleep at last became irresistible. She lay down on the shingles, reposed her head on the cold, hard pillow, folded her shawl still closer, and gave herself up to forgetfulness. So profoundly did she slumber under the influence of the opiate, that for many hours she was insensible of any change in her situation. By degrees only she awoke, by degrees only became aware of the objects around her. The breeze felt fresh and free, so was it ever on the wave-beaten coast. The waters rippled near, their dash had been in her ears as she yielded to repose. But this was not her stony couch, that canopy, not the dark overhanging cliff. Suddenly she lifted up her head. She was on the deck of a small vessel which was skimming swiftly over the ocean waves. A cloak of sables pillowed her head. The shores of Cape Matapan were to her left, and they steered right towards the noonday sun. Wonder rather than fear possessed her. With a quick hand she drew aside the sail that veiled her from the crew. The dreaded Albanian was sitting close at her side, her Constans cradled in his arms. She uttered a cry. Cyril turned at the sound, and in a moment she was folded in his embrace.